Good afternoon, all. Good afternoon. My name is Guy Charles, and I have the privilege of teaching at this awesome law school. So to those of you who are coming here either for the first time or fabulous alums, welcome and welcome back. It is my distinctive pleasure to introduce Professor Lawrence Lessig, who's the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and Director of the Edmund Safra Center of Ethics at Harvard University. Prior to teaching at Harvard, he also taught at Stanford, where he founded the school's Center for Internet and Society, and also at the University of Chicago. He clerked for Judge Richard Posner, as well as for Justice Scalia. He serves on the board of the Creative Commons, Maplight, Brave New Film Foundation, the American Academy, AXA Research Fund, iCommons.org, and is on the advisory board for the Sunlight Foundation. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Association, and he has received a number of numerous awards, in fact, too numerous to name here. He holds a BA in Economics and BS in Management from the University of Pennsylvania, an MA in Philosophy from Cambridge, and a JD from Yale. There are many things that are distinctive about Professor Lessig, but one of the things that I find quite remarkable about him is that he's a leader of three significant fields. He started off and is still a renowned professor of constitutional law. He is extremely well known and is obviously a leading IP scholar. And then now he is a leader of the field of law and democracy. His latest book, Republic Lost: How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Stop It, has taken the field as well as captured the imagination of many individuals very significantly. He is a model from my perspective, and one of the things that I admire about him. He's a model of how one combines rigorous academic enterprise and endeavor with one's passions, and has taken those passions as well as his fierce intellectual acumen to think about and develop different frameworks for helping us to understand our democracy, and particularly campaign finance reform. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lawrence Lessig to do this.
Thank you, Guy. It's wonderful to be back at Duke. There are an incredible number of friends here, and I'm grateful for that. It's a secret he probably doesn't want anybody to know, but Kurt Bradley and I actually lived together when we clerked at the Supreme Court. And I still remember a really horrible evening when I was mugged on the way from work back to our apartment, and Kurt raced back to help me recover from that traumatic experience. And then about a dozen years ago, I was back at the Supreme Court arguing Eldred versus Ashcroft, and I was mugged again, this time by the justices of the Supreme Court. And it was Jamie Boyle who raced to my side to help me recover from that much more devastating experience. So it's wonderful to be here. But I want to talk first about something that's far removed from the Supreme Court and far removed from the question of what people call campaign finance reform. I want to talk about this man. This is Dr. Lonnie Smith. And Dr. Smith was a dentist. He lived in Harris County, Texas, at the beginning of the last century. And Dr. Lonnie Smith believed he had the right to vote. So every election, Dr. Smith would wake up and walk the 3 miles to his polling place, and he would pay his poll tax. And then he would say, "I would like my ballot." And they would say, "Dr. Smith, you don't have the right to vote in the Democratic primary." And he would turn around and he would walk home. And that simple act of disobedience, marked by that slow progression through his town to the polling place, was a certain kind of inspiration. Now, it's kind of hard for us to recognize, I think, that after a civil war, a war which, in the classic bait and switch, President Lincoln re-described at a critical juncture in the war as a war about a certain proposition that all men are created equal. a war which, after its conclusion, created inertia enough to do what everyone thought would have been impossible at the launch of the war, an enactment of an amendment to the Constitution that explicitly protected the rights of African Americans to vote, an amendment which people imagined would move us into a period in American history captured, hopefully, in this graphic, but instead an amendment which was the last great shot before America fell into a very different future for at least the following 80 years. A future at that point which is marked by a concerted effort to exclude African Americans from the right to vote. There were a series of devices: literacy taxes, registration systems, poll tax, the grandfather clause, and then Texas's great innovation, the all-white primary. A series of innovations all designed to keep blacks out of the political process. So there was a franchise. Oxford tells us that the franchise in this sense is a privilege or exclusive right to perform some public function. Framers of the 15th Amendment thought they had franchised African Americans, the verb form of that word, to make or set free, to invest with a franchise or a privilege. That's what the 15th Amendment was to do, to enfranchise African Americans. But in the Old South, they were disenfranchised. The Old South. And when we think about that technique of disenfranchisement, we should recognize its pattern. There was a general election in the Old South, dominated, of course, by the Democratic Party, and there was a white primary, effectively, across the Old South. And in the general election, it's the citizens who got to vote, but in the white primary, it was whites only that got to vote. And of course, you had to win in the white primary if you wanted to run in the general election. Not technically, it was feasible to run in the Republican Party, but effectively, this was the dynamic of the democracy in the Old South. So how can we characterize that democracy? Well, 4 years ago, the Supreme Court gave us a very good way to think about how to characterize that old democracy, because you could say in the Old South that the people, all the people in the Old South, had the ultimate influence over elected officials. They had the ultimate influence because, of course, there was a general election in which all the people got to vote. But all the people had that influence only after the whites had had their way with the candidates who wished to run in that general election. As Boss Tweed used to say, I don't care who does the electin', as long as I get to do the nominating. And that was the dynamic of the Old South's quote-unquote democracy. And number two, obviously, this dependence on the whites produces not so subtle, not so understated, not so camouflaged bending to keep whites happy and to keep the non-whites silent. So this was a democracy of sorts. One depended upon the whites only and ultimately depended upon the people generally. This was a competing set of dependencies, a conflicting set of dependencies, at least for those issues where there was a conflict between whites and blacks, and in that context, the blacks lost. Okay, that's the Old South. And I submit it is astonishing to us how difficult it was to remedy that through the law in the face of an amendment that seemed to expressly protect the rights of blacks to vote. In Nixon versus Herndon, the Supreme Court finally, in 1927, explicitly declared that the all-white primary, as enacted by the Texas legislature, violated the Constitution, not the 15th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. So Texas went back to the drawing board, came up with a slightly different vision that didn't precisely empower the state to exclude blacks, but allowed a, quote, private organization named the Democratic Party to exclude blacks. Came back to the court in 1932, and the court again said no. This still was effectively the exercise of state power, so they went back to the drawing board again. And what we forget in this history is that in 1935, in Grovey versus Townsend, the Supreme Court said, okay, that's fine. You've done it. You've privatized it. Unanimously, the Supreme Court upheld the power of Texas to effectively exclude blacks from the right to vote in the Democratic Party. And at that point, activists didn't imagine how they were going to go forward. It seemed they had reached the end of the line with a unanimous court that excluded a minority from full participation in the election. And then in 1941, the Supreme Court in United States versus Classic created an opportunity to remake that law. Classic was not about an all-white primary. It was about a primary in Louisiana where the votes had basically been rigged, and the question was whether African Americans' vote in that primary should count. And the claim was it's a primary. It's not within the scope of the protection of the Constitution because it's a primary. And the Constitution was worried about elections. And what the court said is, we are now concerned with the question whether the right to choose at a primary election, a candidate for election as a representative, is embraced in the right to choose representatives secured by Article 1, Section 2. And as they went on, we may assume that the framers of the Constitution, in adopting that section, did not have specifically in mind the selection and elimination of candidates for Congress by the direct primary, any more than they contemplated the application of the Commerce Clause to interstate telephone, telegraph, and wireless communication, which are conceitedly within it. We read the words, its words, of the Constitution, not as we read legislative codes, which are subject to continuous revision with the changing course of events, but as the revelation of the great purposes which were intended to be achieved by the Constitution as a continuing instrument of government, the great purposes. And so the changes in the mode of choice from a single step, a general election, to two, of which the first is a choice at a primary of these two candidates, would now be a change contemplated by the protection of the Constitution. And as the court said, there is no historical warrant for supposing that the framers were under the illusion that the method of effecting the choice of the electors would never change, or that if it did, the change was for that reason to be permitted to defeat the rights of the people to choose representatives for Congress, which the Constitution had guaranteed. Okay, so the primary was protected from both private and public interference. Both of them were eliminated by this innovation in the Supreme Court, an innovation Herbert Wechsler had crafted for the Supreme Court in arguing the case before the justices. And so then, shortly afterwards, in Smith versus Allwright, Dr. Lonnie Smith's walk came to victory, as the Supreme Court expressly reversed Grovey and held that the all-white primary was unconstitutional, however formed, even if formed privately. And of course, eventually, not immediately, there were a bunch of fights across the rest of the Old South, but eventually, the court succeeded in guaranteeing an equal right to vote until we got to the question of identification, but we'll get back to that question later, we hope. Okay, but here's the key. There wasn't just one election anymore, that there were now elections the court recognized. Step one was a primary, step two was a general election. Elections. And these elections were public. And by public, what the court meant was the public was entitled to participate equally in those elections. The public, the rich and the poor, male and female, older and younger, and finally, 80 years after the Constitution was enacted, black and white both. Okay, now, that was one key. I want to say there's one more key to this story. One more key to the position of classic. And that is to focus on this language precisely. No historical warrant for supposing that the framers were under the illusion that the method of effecting the choice of the electors would never change. Klassik's position is the court expected change. The framers expected change. But in the face of change, the objective of the court and the obligation of the democracy, if there is to be fidelity to that constitution, fidelity means preserving framing values in light of that change. He was kind enough to remember that I once did constitutional law, and when I did constitutional law, this was my focus, that we find a way to translate framing values. Sometimes to preserve them, sometimes to negate the effect of change which distorts them. Framing values. So the framers of our Constitution gave us what they called a republic. But by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, they meant, as the Federalists explain again and again, a government that would have a branch that would be, quote, dependent on the people alone. Okay, think about this word, the people. As an original matter, would the people include both white and black? The answer to that question is obviously no. The framers didn't care much to protect the rights of blacks. It was only after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that the word the people embraced both. Did the people include men and women? And of course, as an original matter, the answer to that question is obviously no. The framers didn't care much to protect the right of women to participate in elections. They were virtually represented, the framers believed. But after the 17th Amendment, we understand, even after the 17th Amendment, but now we understand that the rights of the people means the right of men and women both. But the people, does it include rich and poor? Because though the framers didn't get race, and though the framers didn't get sex equality, the one thing the framers did get was class. And I don't mean class in the sense of they wore fancy hats and they had really cool coats. I mean class in the sense that they were obsessed with the problem of aristocracy. And the framers plainly believed that the people embraced the people, rich and poor both. As Madison said in Federalist 57, the people, not the rich more than the poor. They were not the aristocrats, they were the anti-aristocrats. They believed they were crafting a system, and many of the presuppositions of their belief were false, but they believed they were crafting a system that would avoid the kind of corrupted aristocracy that the British had seen develop. Now, if there is any framing value that we should be preserving today, if there's anything from that past we should be embracing and bringing to our current constitutional environment, it is that. It is the idea that the system of government must guarantee equal protection for the people, rich or poor. Okay, but what everybody here recognizes is, since 1994 at least, we've seen another change. We've seen elections changing again. We've seen a radical increase in a practice of fundraising. Estimates, I think, now say between 30 and 70% of the time of a congressperson either in office or trying to get to office is the practice of raising money for his or her own election or his or her own party. And as that increasing practice of fundraising has occurred, we have moved to what many have called perpetual campaigns. Here's Obama arguing we can't have perpetual campaigns. Of course, he was on his way to a fundraiser in San Francisco when he made that argument. But the point we should be asking as this change occurs is, what does this change? this radical increase in the practice of fundraising, what does it do to them, to members of Congress, as they spend their time dialing for dollars, calling people across the country they've never even met? B.F. Skinner, a psychologist at Harvard, gave us this image of the Skinner box, where even, I should have put a rat up there, but I put a pigeon just to be kind, but even dumb animals can learn precisely which buttons to push in order to get the sustenance they need. We need to recognize this is a picture of the modern American congressperson. As they learn through the hours, the endless hours that they spend dialing for dollars, which buttons they need to push to get the sustenance they need to get their party back into power. So first, what does it do to them? And secondly, what does it do to us? To us who believe in a democracy, or even those of us who believe in a republic. If the image of the Old South was this image, what we need to recognize is that we in America have once again evolved two elections in our election system. Two elections. There's a discrete election, happens on a particular day, twice every election cycle. And there's a continuous election, which happens 24/7 between one discrete election and the next. In the discrete election, the voting election, people show up and they cast a ballot. In the continuous election, what we should call the money primary, people are constantly asked by members of the politician class to fund their campaigns. In the voting election, all citizens get to vote, if you're 18 or over, in some states if you have an ID. In the money primary, it's the relevant funders of campaigns who get to vote, the relevant funders. And just as in the Old South, what we know is to run in this voting election, you must do extremely well in the money election. You don't necessarily have to win. There are people like Jerry Brown, but you ordinarily must do extremely well. And that expectation leads people to this obsessive practice of raising money. But unlike in the Old South, where the whites constituted 88% of the population, in this new system, the funders constitute, I think, no more than 0.05% of the American population. About 150,000 Americans are the relevant funders of these campaigns. The internet tells me that's about the same number of people as named Lester. Must be true. It's the internet that tells me that, which is why in the TED Talk I described America as Lesterland. And if we see the Supreme Court remove the limits on aggregate contributions in McCutcheon, then I think we're going to have no more than about 35,000 people funding elections, which the internet tells me is about the same number of people named Sheldon. So whether it's Lesterland or Sheldon City, what we need to recognize is that we have two elections, like the white primary and the money primary, radically constrains the number of Americans who get to set the stage for the general election. And that, I think, violates framing values. We have created a two-step democracy again, but unlike the Old South, it's not a two-step democracy where the majority have the powerful role. It's a two-step democracy where the tiniest fraction of the 1% have this powerful role. Now, what can we say about democracy in America then? Well, the Supreme Court, of course, was right. It's the Supreme Court. The people have the ultimate influence over the elected officials. But they have that influence only after the funders have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. And number two, obviously, this dependence upon the funders produces subtle, understated, somewhat camouflaged bending to keep those funders happy. This practice of fundraising, this life as a fundraiser, develops a sixth sense in members of Congress and candidates, a constant awareness about how what they do will affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." And to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So this is a democracy of sorts, one dependent on the funders and dependent upon the people, competing dependencies, conflicting dependencies, depending upon who the funders are. Okay, now, in this group, we've had an ongoing argument about what to call this. This thing that I've described here, this system of democracy, what should we call it? I've said we should call it, quote unquote, corruption. Oxford tells me I'm allowed to call it corruption in the sense of a destruction, dissolution of the Constitution which makes a thing what it is. Here, 1723, when a thing is destroyed or ceases to be what it was before, we call it corruption. Thus we say it is a corruption of the wood, when we see the wood no longer, but only the fire in the place of it. Or Oxford's modern draft edition talks about corruption in the context of electronics. Here, we're told Mac Tools 3.0 continuously checks for disk corruption in the background so small problems don't become disasters. That's precisely the sense in which I think we need to recognize and constantly monitor for this corruption in the background. But as I've engaged in this debate with many of you and many other people around the country, I've begun to recognize that this division is kind of fundamental. The world is divided not between people on the left or people on the right, but between people who insist that corruption is quid pro quo only, or people who think that corruption could be referring to what we might call systemic corruption. So let's have a little survey of these conflicts. Here's the most recent popular instance of this.
And you want to get it out there without saying our system is corrupt, we have to have campaign finance.
But why? Why don't you want to say that? No, it is corrupt.
Because,
the system is corrupt.
The system isn't corrupt.
No.
There is corruption in the system.
No.
But the system isn't corrupt.
It feels to me that the system has been utterly overrun by moneyed interests. I don't think there's any question about it.
Okay, so there's Pelosi on the McConnell side of this divide.
And so I asked the senator from Arizona, how can there be corruption if no one is corrupt? I mean, that's like saying the gang is corrupt, but none of the gangsters are. I mean, if there is corruption, someone must be corrupt. And on the senator's website, he names some projects that he specifically says are in these bills as a result of soft money contributions, which, of course, as we all know, cannot be received by anybody who votes anyway. They're given to parties. And so I repeat my question to the senator from Arizona: who is corrupt?
So the senator responds.
I am not in the business of identifying individuals or attacking individuals. I am attacking the system. I am attacking the system that has to be fixed and that has caused 69% of young Americans between age 18 and 35 to say they are disconnected from their government. That has caused, in the 1998 election, the lowest voter turnout in history of 18 to 26-year-olds. And when those 18 to 26-year-olds were asked, why didn't you vote? Because they believe that we don't represent them anymore. Because they have lost confidence. Because they say that they will not run for public office. That they believe that we are corrupt. So it is the appearance of corruption that is causing young Americans to divorce themselves from the political process, refuse to run for public office. And there is poll after poll and data after data that will reflect that.
Okay, so McConnell's still skeptical.
Friend from Arizona's statement, and I'm still trying to understand it. I know the senator from Tennessee has the floor, so I don't know whether to pose this question to him or the senator from Arizona. Hopefully we can get answers from both. Okay. Is the senator from Arizona saying then it's possible to have corruption that is, and no one is corrupt? You can have corruption and yet there isn't anybody actually responsible for it?
So he's trying out for Austin Powers at this moment. And McCain's now a little bit impatient.
I'd say to my friend from Tennessee that either the senator from Kentucky did not listen to what I said or doesn't care about what I said. I repeat again. A definition of corruption from Webster's dictionary: corruption, the impairment of integrity, virtue, or moral principle. I repeat again, we have impaired our integrity. We convey to the American people the impression that soft money distorts the legislative process, such as it did, in my view, in the 1996 Telecommunications Deregulation Act, which caused increases, protection of special interests, which caused increase in cable rates, phone rates, and has led to mergers rather than competition in the industry. So this system has impaired our integrity. That does not mean bribery laws were broken necessarily. They may have been. I don't know. But I do know that our integrity has been impaired. And whether that's the senator from Kentucky's view or the senator from Utah's view or my view, it's the view of the American people, and that is substantiated by polling data and personal experience.
So then Fred Thompson thought he had
That's
the...
right. All of our integrity is now impaired, all of us.
Yes, all our integrity is impaired. That's exactly McCain's view. Then Fred Thompson thought he would pile on with this great question.
37 companies, corporations, gave $50,000 or more to both parties. Both parties. I would ask the senator why he thinks they did that.
Well, I'm grateful that they did, because it gave us an opportunity to compete with the newspapers and the special interest groups that are out there that have a constitutional right to participate in the political process. And I'm extraordinarily grateful that all of these disclosed contributions, and this is why my friend from Tennessee knows who contributed.
Those are the old days.
Extraordinarily grateful that these companies are giving us the opportunity to engage in vote buying.
Yes, you did hear him say that, too. Opportunity to engage in vote buying. So these two sides are pretty familiar, but in the course of doing the research for this, I found this incredible gem that I want to share with you from an incredible senator who, of course, we've lost, which is Paul Wellstone, trying to put this debate into some context.
The kind of corruption that I think we're talking about is actually much more serious than the wrongdoing of an individual office holder. That's not what I would focus on. And I gather that's some of what my colleagues have focused on and questioned. I would say it's much more serious, and I would say that it is a systemic corruption, and it's a systemic corruption when there is a huge imbalance between too few people with so much wealth and so much power and so much access and so much say, and the vast majority of people in the country who don't make the big contributions, aren't the heavy hitters, aren't the investors, and who believe that if you don't pay, you don't play. I think that's the corruption. I think the corruption is that the standard of a democracy, a representative democracy, which says that each person should count as one and no more than one, is violated. And I think if any senator, Democrat or Republican, should go into any cafe in Minnesota or around the country and try and make the argument that as a matter of fact, because of this system we have here, which I think is really a failure when it comes to any standard of representative democracy, if we were to try to argue, no, it's not true that people who are the investors and make all these big contributions don't have too much access and too much say, I think 99% of the people in the country would say you're not credible. Of course that's what's going on. Of course people make contributions for a variety of different reasons, but one of which is to have the access and the say. And you know what? I say to my colleagues from Utah, whom I respect, I think it's a bipartisan problem. We don't need to get, and we don't need to talk about individual cases, and I understand the comments he's tried to make, but I would say I see it on both sides of the aisle. I mean, look, we have, you know, both parties will talk about special gatherings that we'll have with business community here or high-tech community there or labor community here. We'll have special gatherings that we go to where big contributors come, and all of it is, you know, what is done. We have big dinners, and we're all told to come to those dinners, and who are those dinners? And these dinners are the big contributors. And we're told to come and be there. I mean, it seems like if you don't come, that you have no interest. Both parties give these lectures at caucuses to all of us. And we go. And the reason we go is we feel like, given the system we have, people have to raise money, and if you don't come and you're not up for re-election, you feel like, well, gosh, when you were up for election, you certainly hoped, given this rotten system we had, that there was enough money raised for you, so now you go to help other people. But the truth of the matter is, the vast majority of people in the country don't come to these dinners. The vast majority of people in the country aren't invited to these special gatherings and special sessions. The people that are invited by both parties are the big contributors. They're the investors. Come on. You're not going to try and argue on the floor of the United States Senate that we don't have a problem with a systemic corruption where we've got just too few people who make these big contributions who, as a result, perhaps have too much access and too much say. It's not just a question of perception. Let me go out on the limb. It's not just a question of perception. The vast majority of people in our country today believe that their concerns about themselves and their families and their communities are of little concern in the corridors of power or the corridors of the halls of the Congress here in Washington, D.C. And you know what? We've given them entirely too much justification from that point of view. They're not necessarily wrong. They're not necessarily wrong. Now, I'm not going to have somebody all of a sudden, ask me to yield for a question and take my head off because it looks like I'm making an individual accusation. I'm not going to do that. But I'll tell you something right now. I'm fully prepared as the United States Senator from Minnesota, and I'm fully prepared as a political scientist to tell you that I see certain people who also happen to be the big contributors who have way too much access here. I don't know who we think we're kidding. When we had a debate on the telecommunications bill in the anteroom, outside there, it was packed with people. I couldn't find truth, beauty, and justice anywhere. Representing billions of dollars here, billions of dollars there. And when we had a debate about the welfare bill, whatever you think about the welfare bill, where were the poor mothers and children? Where was their powerful lobby? They were nowhere to be found. And when we decide where we're going to make deficit reduction and where we're going to make cuts, and when we do tax policy, and when we do a whole lot of other policy, it just so happens that certain folks and certain interests seem to be much better represented than others. I think that's true. I think we can make it better. I think we can do a lot better job of reaching the standard of each person should count as one and no more than one. And certainly, we've got corruption. But it's not individual, it's not the wrongdoing of any individual office holder that I know of. It's systemic. When you have this frightening imbalance of power between the elites, the few, and those that make the big contributions that are so well connected, and the majority of the people who basically feel locked out. And you know what? They have every reason to feel locked out. That's the problem.
Amen. So this institution, though, is also fundamentally affected by this debate about what this term corruption means. Right? We can think about the influence of money on the institution of Congress or the influence of money on the people. Court's focus has been on quid pro quo, not so much quid pro quo on the institution, but quid pro quo on individuals within the institution. And the question the court should be addressing is that the only sense of corruption? Now, I've tried to answer that question following the work of Zephyr by asking the question, well, how would the framers have understood this word corruption? What would it have meant to them? Would they have meant the word to mean quid pro quo corruption? Would they have meant it to predicate of individuals or of institutions? And if of institutions, what would that have meant to them? So I asked some researchers to go look at that because, of course, we now have the resources to be able to see exactly how they used their words. And by looking at all the framing documents, they were able to collect 325 instances of the word corruption being used at the time of the framing, or it's actually more like that it was being used. And then those instances were coded by these researchers to try to characterize what the word meant when it was being used in the context in which it was being used. And their findings were quite dramatic. Of course, the framers used the word to mean quid pro quo. Out of 325 times, they used it to mean quid pro quo 6 times. 6 times. 1.8% of the usage was to mean quid pro quo corruption. And when they used it to mean quid pro quo, they were always speaking of individuals. But in the balance of the cases, talks of individuals were relatively rare. Corruption predicated of individuals were relatively rare. Much more common was corruption predicated of institutions. 57% of the usages were descriptions of corruption of institutions. And the most common of these forms is what we could call corruption through improper dependence. 9% of the instances, 5 times the instances of quid pro quo, were describing an improper dependence of an institution, a dependence different from the dependence intended for that institution. Now, why is this relevant? Why is the framers' understanding of this relevant? Well, it's, of course, because there are originalist wannabes throughout that court. Members of the court who would say that they interpret the Constitution by understanding how the framers would have used or understood certain words. That's not the end of their interpretive practice, but it's the beginning of their interpretive practice. And so my view is, for the question, is quid pro quo it? Given the history, no originalist could say quid pro quo corruption is the only conception of corruption, just as no originalist could say that extending copyright terms is consistent with the words limited times. Corruption, in this sense, I'm not offering this history as a way to describe what corruption means. So Yasmin Dawood's incredible paper, which I was grateful to read on the way up to this conference, very powerfully unpacks this question of what exactly we would use the originalist understanding for. And I guess I would say I'm not using it for saying what the word corruption means, but I am using it for the purpose of saying it's not possible, consistent with the principles of originalism, to say corruption just means quid pro quo corruption. It is for the negative purpose of rejecting the assertion, which I think the originalist will have to make if they limit the scope of First Amendment review to quid pro quo corruption alone, that this understanding of corruption is the only appropriate one, at least from the perspective of their constitutional philosophy. Okay, now, for 7 years, I've been involved in this process of talking about this. But let me end by reminding about a different way of thinking about this question. Not just the question of talking about this problem, but the perspective of walking for an argument about this problem. As I'm sure many of you know, we've just come back from really an incredible expedition across New Hampshire. Zephyr was one of the people walking on this expedition, but an incredible group of people who followed in the footsteps of Granny D and in the footsteps of Lonnie Smith to walk across New Hampshire to talk about this question of corruption within the system of our government. And just before we started this walk, Gallup did a poll that tried to evaluate what the top issues for Americans were. And if you divide them, Republicans, Independents, and Democratic top issues, it's not surprising to see the incredible gap between these 3 categories. So number 9 on the Republicans' list is the rich-poor gap. That's number 6 for Independents and Democrats. Number 6 on the Republicans' list is ethics and morals. That's number 9 for Independents and number 7 for Democrats. Number 4 on the Republicans' list is the federal deficit. That's number 5 for Independents and, of course, number 9 for Democrats. But the most extraordinary thing about this study was this line that I've blocked out. Because the issue that's number one for all three of these groups is the same: government. Government is the same across these groups, described as dissatisfaction with government, Congress, politicians, poor leadership, corruption, and abuse of power. We are at a moment when all of us think this is the most important issue. And we did a poll the month before that tried to understand what this attitude was. We asked, do you think the current political system works well or is in need of reform? 80% says need of reform. Do you think it is corrupt? 71% believe it is corrupt. How important is it to you that the influence of money in politics be reduced? 96% of Americans believe it important that the influence of money in politics be reduced. 96%. But if you turn to the pundits, of course, the pundits would say to you, America doesn't care about the issue of money in politics, just doesn't care. They don't vote about it. They're not going to throw somebody out about it. They're not going to elect somebody because of it. Now, I think the pundits are wrong. It's important here because this is the first time ever that the pundits have been wrong. I think the pundits are wrong because they're missing an important interaction in the context of these polls. So 96% of Americans believe it's important to reduce the influence of money in politics. But the next question we asked, how likely do you think it is that the influence of money in politics will be reduced? 91% believe it not likely that the influence in money in politics will be reduced. So when you take 96% and you add it to 91%, you begin to understand the incredible resignation that most Americans have about this issue. Look, I think at least 96% of us would love to fly like Superman. But because at least 91% of us believe that's impossible, we don't systematically throw ourselves off of tall buildings. As much as we would want to, we don't do it because we accept it's not possible, so we don't try. And that's the same thing here. I think Americans don't accept that we can do anything about this, and so they don't try, and so they have this passion, and when we can call it out, it expresses itself in the most powerful way. So when we, as part of this New Hampshire rebellion, tried to find a way to give voice to this passion, a rebellion that really takes its focus on a fight that happened in New Hampshire 15 years ago, where New Hampshire was a focus for this type of fundamental reform. January 1st, 1999, Doris Haddock, aka Granny D, started a walk across the country from Los Angeles to Washington with a sign on her chest that said campaign finance reform. She started at the age of 88. She ended at the age of 90. She had traveled 3,200 miles in the name of making this issue fundamental. But the same year, June 30th, John McCain came to Bedford and gave his famous speech talking about the system of corruption that then tweaked McConnell so much that he would have to go to the floor of the Senate to challenge McCain for calling America corrupt. Our objective was to find a way to revive that movement, to find a way to get people to force the candidates in the 2016 primary to talk about this issue, to address it, to make it once again central and important. And as we walked across the 185 miles of New Hampshire, remember, in January, we began to see in the reactions of the people an incredible passion, really something far greater than anything I could imagine. People screaming out of their car, coming out of their house in their pajamas, putting signs in the front of their house saying, welcome Granny D walkers. People passionate to find a way to talk about this issue and make it possible that something could be done about it. And when you think about the numbers, it's not hard to see how New Hampshire could be a focus for making something done about this issue. There are 1.1 million people in New Hampshire, 750,000 voters. But in 2008, the difference between Clinton and Obama was 8,000 votes. In 2012, the difference between Romney and Paul was 40,000 votes. Those are small numbers. And it suggests that there is a way to make it possible to surface this issue such that it begins to be a focal point in that campaign. I mean, imagine that we could find just 50,000 people from New Hampshire who commit to make this their first issue. We weave a briar patch through New Hampshire. So no candidate can go into that state without this being the issue they're forced to confront. As they're asked again and again How are you going to address this system of corruption in Washington? We can begin to imagine the shape-shifting that they would begin to engage in response to that question as they recognize the salience and importance of this issue to the people in New Hampshire, and then shape-shifting would begin to be our friend. Now, I think there's a certain inspiration here that's possible to trigger. And I found in this incredible 185 miles, even if one's not convinced it's possible to win. Indeed, to think about this place of the walker in our political history and the inspiration that this simple civil act that all of us can engage in produces as people see and reflect on exactly what it means. It's not just in America, of course. It's not just with winners. It's also all across the world. I met a person in Belgium just over the weekend who organized a 100,000-person march. 100,000 people walked 300 miles to Delhi in 2012. That was after he organized 25,000 people to walk in 2007. The walking, the act, the physical act of taking this issue on the road with other people builds through the conversations these bonds and commitments and friendships. We need to think of a category. We're going to name that category. We're going to call them GD walkers, by which I just mean Granny D walkers, right? Granny D walkers, people who use this physical act to create an understanding of a certain type of movement, even when it doesn't seem possible. Because think again about Lonnie Smith, disenfranchised, unanimous Supreme Court telling him it was constitutional to disenfranchise him. Yet this act of expressing the indignity of that political reality, the simple act of expressing the indignity through that walk to the polls every election, reminds us that if they can do that, they, the African Americans who waged that fight, the whites who joined with them to wage that fight, if for a minority they could express the indignity powerfully enough to motivate a political movement and eventually a judicial recognition of the injustice, then we can too. We can, not the 99%, right? The 99.95%. We can too. We can build a movement to claim our rights of equal dignity as citizens. And we have to. We have children and we have parents. We owe them. We owe them things that we need a government to secure, a future, security, a healthy planet. So after 185 miles, I can report that Robert Frost was right. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. But we all of us have promises to keep, and miles to go before we sleep, and miles to go before we sleep. Thank you very much. So do you want me to take questions? So I'm happy to take questions. It's a law school. I can cold call on people, too.
Great presentation. I'm sympathetic and inspired. But I'm a law professor, so I also have to be a contrarian. So the issue that I wonder how you address, right, is the phenomena that we saw with the debt ceiling stuff, right, where you had elites, right, with financial interests basically acting in an anti-populist manner against Tea Party candidates in a way that actually, I think for most economists would say, saves the economic system in the United States rather than destroy it. That is, you have a populist movement that is not sophisticated enough or just doesn't care or is not paying attention to the consequences of an actual policy, and you have moneyed interests that's actually acting as a counter to what would otherwise be a cataclysmic decision. So how do you account for that type of phenomena in your larger ambition of the opposition to moneyed interest in politics?
Yeah, so I don't accept the characterization of the Tea Party as unsophisticated in that fight. I think they were very sophisticated because they have a business model. Their business model is to build a faction of a party, maybe a different party. And what they recognize is the more extreme they are, the easier it is for them to raise money. Indeed, the extraordinary take that that the Tea Party leaders had during that debt crisis was really phenomenal. I mean, if you just asked from the fundraising perspective, what's the most effective way for them to succeed in raising the funds they will need to compete in 2014, playing games like that are exactly it. So their interest is not governing. Their interest is creating the conditions so they can govern in the way in which they want to govern, which is obviously different from most in the Republican Party and certainly the Democratic Party. So that was very sensible. And partly related, I think, to a strategy for raising money, right? So we've created a system where extremism pays. Chris Murphy, the youngest member of the Senate from Connecticut, described that when they send out an email criticizing the Republicans, they raise 3 times the money they raise when they send out as when they send out an email praising the Democrats. The business model of fundraising is polarization. So that was what you saw manifested there. Now, thank God, sensible minds were able to intervene to stop the catastrophe that was going to bring about. But I wouldn't suggest, I don't think you can move from the single time that sane minds stepped in to avoid a catastrophe to a conclusion that money is not playing a pervasively corrupting role inside the system. I don't think one follows from the other. I think, indeed, this dynamic is precisely explained by the way in which money is so central to the system. Why else would they threaten, this economic catastrophe, other than finding a way to rally their base, which they certainly succeeded in raising the money at least. Who knows whether they will still have the votes. Yeah.
So this was terrific. I envy your PowerPoint skills. I would never pull that off. I wanted to take you back to Lonnie Smith. And when he was walking in, it's a powerful story. He was walking at a different time. He had bad precedent, but he also had classic, as you pointed out, and he had a world war that was making our racial politics at home look not so good as we fought fascism abroad. And he had 7 new justices on the Supreme Court from the time the court had decided Roe v. And fast forwarding to now, we don't have classic. We have one bad decision after another. And so you persuade 50,000 voters in New Hampshire to do something. What does that person do, even if they're going to shift their shape to where you want them to be?
Yeah. So when Smith walked through Texas, it wasn't the case that 96% of Texans believed there should be equality in Texas. It just wasn't the case. But when we walked through New Hampshire, 96% of New Hampshireites believed there should be less influence of money in politics. I did this little shtick where I would go around, especially in North New Hampshire, and I would say, I'm looking for the 4%. Are you some of the 4%? We met these state games wardens on the frozen ice. And he looked at me when I asked him, are you 4%? It was like I'd asked him about a Martian that he had just had lunch with. He said, what the hell are you talking about? There's nobody up here who thinks that the influence of money should not be reduced, right? So I think the difference is not in the elites. The difference is in the grassroots. This is, I think back about the fight around, copyright. That was also a fight where when we started, most people were on the other side. So, as I'm getting older, I'm taking on easier fights. I'm starting with a battle where we all are already there. Now, what we're going to do about it, there's lots of contest about that. Like, what's the right answer? Lots of contest. I agree. But this is this moment where we've got to find a way to leverage the grassroots to control the elite. Because, the truth is, as, you've seen me write about this before, I don't think the Supreme Court is the problem. I don't think the Supreme Court's the problem. Anybody who knows Elena Kagan knows she will eventually wrestle them to the ground, and they will be on the right side of this issue. Whether it's Scalia or Kennedy or the next Scalia or Kennedy, she will win that issue. We don't need to worry about that. The fight we've got to wage is to produce the pressure to force them to enact the kind of legislation like the Government by the People Act that Congressman Sarbanes and Nancy Pelosi introduced this week that would radically change the way we fund elections. That's the fight. And that's a democratic fight. And that's a democratic fight where we start out with all the people in the country on our side. And so, that's the big difference. You're right. They had a lot of things. But I think if Lonnie Smith were here and you gave him a choice between 96% of the people believing with him that there ought to be equality and a couple justices on the Supreme Court, he would pick the fight we have over the fight that they had. Yeah.
So, I'm interested in your originalist argument about the meaning of corruption. Usually, original arguments cash out somewhere in the text, but I think corruption only appears in corrupting of the blood, which has nothing to do with this. So I'm wondering how that cashes out.
It's a great question because I think it's a complicated question to think how originalism is going to play here. And the way that I'm thinking about it is, if you're an originalist and you are justifying restricting the power of Congress to pass a law, then the standard position is I need either text or a strong originalist understanding. Okay, they don't have text unless you radically change the way in which you interpret the First Amendment, but they've now adopted a non-originalist understanding of the First Amendment, and the non-originalist understanding of the First Amendment is you can regulate this sort of speech if you're regulating quote-unquote corruption. So where does the originalist go to find the meaning of the word corruption? One choice is what Justice Burger meant, Chief Justice Burger's meaning. But how does an originalist justify picking Chief Justice Burger's meaning? Right? I mean, the scholarship about corruption, and again, Professor Daywood's piece is so powerful about this, the scholarship about corruption shows us there are 40,000 understandings of the word corruption. The meaning is all over the map. So it would be completely arbitrary if what you said as an originalist is what Chief Justice Burger says. So I think an originalist has got to go back to, okay, what I mean by corruption is what they would have meant by corruption. And if you do that, then you fall into Zephyr's trap. What they meant by corruption is not quid pro quo alone. They certainly meant that, but not that alone. So you have no authority for restricting the scope of Congress's legislative power on the basis of the meaning of the word corruption. And if you do, then you must have some non-originalist reason for doing it. And it would be the first time that the originalist had a non-originalist reason for doing what they were doing, no doubt. But the point is, at least you put them in that position of having to justify, if they in fact are going to write something that acknowledges the argument, how they're deviating from what their method ordinarily should say. But you're completely right. It's not the traditional originalist point where I'm looking at the word commerce in the Article 1, Section 8. It's a two-step process, but I don't see how they get out of it if, in fact, they're going to be restricting the power of Congress to legislate.
Eric, we take one more.
Okay, one more from the back. You're in the back.
Yeah, so apologize if you were talking about this morning because I wasn't in the conference this morning, but
yeah, neither was I, I'm sorry.
Which is, it seems like there's kind of, to me, as somebody who studies criminal law, there's kind of a category mistake going on here, which is, it sounds like a kind of criminal law concept of corruption is being used in a conversation that's about something very different. That is, the positive authority of a legislature and the contours of a political law reform discussion about good, bad government. So I guess I get, in the wake of Citizens United, why you want to win the word corruption, because it's become the territory on which this fight is being had. But this whole thing is kind of a mistake in the sense that the quid pro quo concept comes from criminal law, and the reason to have it is because we need a way to draw a line between sausage making and who should go to prison. And what we're really having here is a conversation about how to clean up the sausage, not about who goes to prison. And so it's like we need a different terminology. We either need to take the word corruption away from the criminal law, or you need a better word like clean government.
Yeah, so I completely agree with you. And I've had the benefit of not just reading Zephyr's article, but also reading the book, which is about to come out this fall, which is the slam dunk, absolute, definitive argument that establishes the complete lack of justification for the narrowing of the term corruption in the way the Supreme Court has done it. And so you're right, there is an argument that the Supreme Court, with the Supreme Court, about the meaning of the word corruption, which I am in part trying to advance here. But the thing that, I think that these 185 miles convinced me was there are two different contexts in which we're having this conversation. One conversation I've been having again and again in my role as a law professor is to say there is no justification for the narrowing of the term corruption in understanding the scope of Congress's power. That argument is to the court. And it's a little bit to Rick, but it's also to the court. Like there are people that's an argument. It's not slam dunk. I mean, it's serious, honest people can have genuine disagreements about it. But that's that argument. But you're right. That's not the argument to have out in the streets. I don't care about the meaning of the word corruption. So the question is, what's the argument outside in the streets? And increasingly, I think the argument out there in the streets is to get people to recognize the way in which their dignity has been taken away by this system of elections. They have been put into second-class status by the fact that we understand the power that happens in the money election is a power they don't have, they are not enfranchised to participate in. And that, nags at people. Now, if I were just talking to liberals, I would talk about this a little bit differently. But I think the thing that the discipline of New Hampshire is to recognize, you've got to talk to conservatives too. And the thing that nagged most when we were talking about this was just this sense that they were not, equal citizens in this fight. And so I ultimately think that's got to be the thing that motivates people, the immorality of a political system that denies that participation. It's a version of the equality argument that Rick has been pushing since the very beginning. He advanced vouchers, but also the constitutional argument around equality. But it's a different kind of equality argument. It's about equality and participation, which this current structure has denied. And so I think that getting ordinary people in the democracy to recognize the significance of that denial is the kind of motivation to get them to begin to take the extraordinary steps that it will take, that of course the civil rights movement demonstrated, to finally claim back that power. And so that's, I think ultimately where the fight is. And again, as much as I waste my time arguing about the meaning of the word corruption, I, as I've said, don't think that's ultimately where we've got to win. They will solve their problem themselves. We've got to solve the problem of democracy.
Please join us.